John and I tied the knot 22 years ago in the small church in our hometown. Our early years of marriage were filled with love, passion, and dreams of a shared future. We enjoyed our closeness moments at night and couldn't get enough of each other during the day. We used to stroll hand in hand through the charming streets of our town, stealing kisses at every turn. A couple of years later, our daughter Emily was born, and our focus shifted to raising her. Over time, our relationship lost some of its initial excitement and transformed into a typical family routine. John pursued a career as a long-haul truck driver, going on week-long trips across the country, and always looking forward to returning home to my warmth and care. These reunions felt like honeymoons, and this arrangement suited both of us. I started my own small, cozy beauty salon and gradually earned a reputation among local fashion-conscious individuals. As Emily grew up and pursued a prestigious degree in interior design at an out-of-state university, John and I took pride in her determination and hard work. However, during John's most recent visit home, I began to feel irritation and tension in his presence. I found myself annoyed by every little thing about him, from his morning coffee-drinking habits to his nightly snoring. I eagerly looked forward to the end of his vacation, yearning for some alone time. 2 days later, John set off on another long-haul trip across multiple states. Without much regret, I bid him farewell and eagerly anticipated 3 weeks of solitude in our cozy house on the outskirts. The prospect of living for myself brought me increasing joy. During the first week, I focused on self-care, sleeping in, reading books by lamplight, and enjoying solitary lunches at my favorite restaurants. I relished the freedom from daily responsibilities and the ability to live solely for my pleasure. However, by the middle of John's journey, I began to feel a sense of boredom and longing for his return. One warm April day, I ventured to take a walk around the town square near our house, but an unexpected chilly wind forced me into a cozy corner cafe for a warm cappuccino. The waiter, a young, tall, and handsome man, turned out to be the son of an old friend, Aaron. We chatted, reminiscing about mutual friends and acquaintances. Later, I placed an order and couldn't help but admire Aaron's professionalism and charm. I found myself captivated by his confidence, broad shoulders, and enchanting smile. His attentive and admiring gaze made me feel incredibly beautiful and desirable. Despite no longer being a young woman, I couldn't get Aaron out of my mind. That night, for the first time in years, I had an enticing erotic dream involving Aaron. The following day, I found it challenging to focus at my salon due to persistent thoughts and fantasies about the young man, Aaron. I frequently checked Aaron's social media profiles and photos. One day, John caught me looking at Aaron's Instagram and became suspicious. We argued, with John feeling that I was hiding something from him. Even on his last trip, John left without a proper goodbye. A few days after he departed, Aaron messaged me on Facebook, confessing his thoughts about me and his desire to meet again. I believed it was fate and eagerly suggested meeting at a cozy Italian restaurant by the waterfront. After dinner and a few glasses of wine, we kissed in the backseat of a taxi, leading to an unforgettable night. I was aware that John would be away on the road for another 3 weeks, so I had no reservations about inviting Aaron to stay with me during that time. On weekends, we ventured on picnics to a scenic valley outside the city, strolled hand in hand in secluded areas of the city park, and watched romantic movies at the cinema, where we shared kisses in the back row. I was excited by the idea of having a passionate affair with a young lover while my husband was off on long trips. However, what truly thrilled me were the passionate nights spent with the energetic 20-year-old in our marital bed. It felt like a rekindling of my youthful, carefree dating days. The deception was unexpectedly unveiled in the most shocking manner. John luckily returned from his trip a couple of days earlier than planned. Remembering our big argument before he left and the 2 weeks of no communication, he decided to surprise me. Arriving home, John brought a large bouquet of red roses and a bottle of champagne, looking forward to a romantic evening with me after our time apart. Little did he know how this day would take a dreadful turn. As he neared the house, he noticed the dimmed lights in the bedroom and living room, which pleased him as it indicated I was already home. With anticipation, he quietly entered the house using his key. Beautiful, instrumental music played in the living room. Leaving the bouquet and champagne in the kitchen, he cautiously ascended the stairs to the bedroom. The door was partially open, and a horrifying sight met his eyes. I, his beloved wife, whom he had missed for 2 weeks, was without clothes, kneeling before a young man who held me by the hair, with my hands cuffed behind my back. The young man was the first to notice John in the doorway, recoiling in fear. I turned around in confusion. I barely had time to register John's clenched fists before he lunged at my lover in a blind rage, brutally assaulting him with my handcuffs. I could do nothing to intervene but scream and cry, helplessly pleading with my husband to stop the violence. Finally, John, breathing heavily, pulled away from the battered young man. His hands were still clenched as he stared into my eyes, exuding a mix of disgust and a desire to tear me apart. I backed against the wall and tried to explain, but John refused to listen. He moved closer and punched the wall beside me with great force. In that moment, fear consumed me, and I mentally prepared to face dire consequences. However, John managed to keep his composure, not wanting to escalate the situation further. "Get out of here now," he growled, pushing the lovers without clothes out the door despite our protests. His anger was so intense that he didn't care what would become of us in our disheveled state. He didn't know, nor did he want to know, what happened to us afterward. The following day, John filed for divorce at the marriage registration office, and in the evening, he drank at a bar until he passed out. When he woke up the next morning with a severe hangover, he realized that his life was completely shattered, and he had to start anew at the age of 45. It was excruciatingly difficult and painful. He saw me a few times during the divorce and property division process. I begged for forgiveness, cried, and pleaded with him to keep our family intact for the sake of our shared past and our daughter. However, John remained resolute. Later, he learned that I did move in with the young lover, despite objections from his mother and disapproval from friends and acquaintances. Although he told our daughter that he wished us happiness, deep down he still harbored resentment toward us both. He realized our relationship was destined to fail due to our age and life experience differences. In time, the young man would likely find a younger partner, leaving me alone. John decided to move forward and not dwell on the past. He relocated to a different city, found an interesting new job, and met a woman his own age who understood him. While the scars on his soul remained, life carried on.
To unexpectedly find myself in a situation like the one I'm about to describe, where I have to reevaluate the two people I care about the most, is quite surprising. It serves as a reminder that trust can be a complex and unpredictable thing. Sometimes, deceitful people can be among our loved ones, even within our own families. So, let's begin with the fact that I never believed in love at first sight until I met Emily. We worked together at a fast food restaurant, and I was instantly drawn to her striking blue eyes, radiant smile, and long blonde hair. Before Emily came into my life, I was comfortable with the casual dating scene. For a while, I had different girls visiting my place almost every night, and I initially thought that's what I wanted. However, Emily taught me a valuable lesson without even physical contact. From the start, I understood that winning her over wouldn't be easy. Emily resisted my advances because she thought I was like the other guys she'd encountered. I assumed she found me somewhat unpleasant. Despite our brief conversations, which rarely exceeded 5 minutes, I was determined to show her that I was different. I did have some similarities with those guys, but I genuinely wanted to change, so I spent several weeks trying to convince her of my true uniqueness, which meant breaking down the false image I had created before this story unfolds. It's important to note that I hadn't finished college at that time. I had a challenging period in my life when I decided to drop out of school, feeling like the world was against me. This story is familiar to many people who have faced similar challenges. I believed the education system was unjust, especially because I struggled with social anxiety. Unfortunately, by the time I found a therapist to help me, I had already made the decision to leave school. So, I began working at a fast food restaurant, feeling like my parents had lost faith in me. Despite my decision to leave school, my parents supported me by covering therapy costs while I lived in their basement. However, I couldn't escape the shadow of my older brother John, who was a star in their eyes. He had an office job and an economics degree, and he was even getting ready to marry his high school sweetheart. Throughout most of my life, I tried to measure up to his success. Despite my academic setbacks, I relentlessly searched for ways to earn my parents' approval and prove my worth. I became consumed by the idea of surpassing him. In their eyes, it seemed like an impossible task, and I felt like a loser compared to John's accomplishments. This was the most painful part, and every day I spent in the basement, I felt the weight of my family's rejection. It was disheartening to feel like an outcast in a place where unconditional acceptance should have been the norm. Life began to lose its appeal, and simply existing became a struggle. To break down Emily's barriers, I realized I needed to break down my own. I started with small acts of affection, like holding the door open for her and dealing with customers we both disliked. I focused on genuinely listening to her, putting aside my own careless thoughts, and maintaining a respectful and attentive demeanor. Gradually, I noticed her guard began to come down, and she started opening up to me. When I entered a relationship with Emily, it felt like I stepped into a whole new world where I could finally breathe freely. I hadn't even realized how trapped I'd been until she let her walls down, revealing the incredible person she truly was. Every date with her turned into an exciting adventure, meticulously crafted by her creative spirit. We ventured beyond the ordinary, discovering hidden gems in fascinating places. We even took spontaneous trips to nearby cities in Emily's trusty Toyota. One of our favorite pastimes was visiting amusement parks. Despite my paralyzing fear of heights, Emily encouraged me to ride roller coasters, and her presence gave me an unwavering sense of strength. With her, I felt invincible, as she continually reminded me that life was meant to be enjoyed, no matter the obstacles. She saw potential in me, even when I didn't see it myself. When I finally mustered the courage to share my life story with her, I expected laughter or rejection, but her response was entirely unexpected. Despite it being a joking remark, my living situation in my parents' basement and my lack of a high school diploma could have made Emily doubt me as an ideal partner. But that wasn't the case. She empathized with my struggles because she had faced similar challenges with her own parents. They were demanding and overbearing, constantly pressuring her to meet their standards. Instead of caving into that pressure, Emily boldly chose to chart her own path and live life on her terms, even in modest living conditions. In a small apartment near a diner, she made the most of her space, turning it into a cozy haven that felt like ours. Thanks to her influence, I learned to cherish the seemingly insignificant moments that often slip by unnoticed. This was one of the many qualities I admired in her. In her presence, I discovered a safe space where I could be truly authentic, free from the weight of my parents' expectations and the scrutiny of others. So, her betrayal was especially hard to accept. Against my better judgment, I introduced Emily to my parents. The reason behind this decision remained unclear to me, as I had long stopped caring about their opinion. Yet a part of me still yearned for their recognition. Emily was the only source of normalcy and goodness in my life, and I wanted my parents to see that. It happened on that fateful evening when she encountered everyone, including John. At that time, I didn't see any signs of anxiety. I foolishly thought their interaction was purely friendly and polite. After all, his fiancée was there, and I couldn't imagine any hidden motives behind their newfound friendliness. But from that evening onward, I started noticing changes in Emily's behavior. She grew distant, and it seemed like she wasn't putting as much effort into our relationship. Initially, I hesitated to admit this, fearing I might seem overly possessive or paranoid. I convinced myself that these worries were just products of my overactive imagination, or that something was bothering Emily. She had always been my pillar of support, my confidant, who I jokingly called my little therapist, the one I turned to for support. Unfortunately, I was too forgetful to connect the dots. In an attempt to prevent our relationship from falling apart, I tried to be close to her and offer constant support, but my efforts didn't seem to make a difference. Instead of appreciating my presence, Emily started seeing me as overly intrusive and invasive, as if I were prying too deeply into her life. Overnight, Emily stopped engaging in our usual activities like going to the movies or visiting amusement parks. Our conversations dwindled, and I found myself in a state of panic. It felt like I was on the verge of losing the only source of happiness in my life, and that thought was unbearable. Desperate to salvage our relationship, I made an impulsive decision to take on a second job at a local shoe store. I know it might sound feeble, but I genuinely believed that by being able to buy more things for her, I could bring joy back into our relationship. I clung to the hope that my gifts would rekindle the fading spark between us. She accepted them with visible pleasure, but unfortunately, they didn't improve our relationship in any way. No matter how hard I tried, nothing seemed to have a positive impact. In fact, the more I tried to win her back with gifts, gestures, and sacrifices, the quicker her love for me seemed to fade. In an effort to salvage what was left, I decided to surprise Emily by giving her some space, allowing her to breathe without feeling suffocated by my presence. I assumed she would want to see me after this break. There was some improvement in our conversations, which led me to believe that we were gradually repairing our relationship, or so I convinced myself to see a glimmer of hope in Emily's eyes. I saved money for several weeks to buy her the coveted bracelet she wanted, hoping it would be a tangible symbol of my love and dedication. The gift came with a beautiful bouquet of her favorite flowers. I desperately wanted her to understand the depth of my affection and how committed I was to our relationship. Looking back on it now, I can't help but cringe at how pitiful and desperate I appeared as I approached her house. Each step was filled with anticipation, and the mere thought of seeing her again was pure joy. It was excruciating to be away from her, but today I'd finally reunite with her. With a spare key in hand, I carefully entered her house, observing the faint glow of her lamps from beneath the door. However, as soon as I stepped inside, an unexpected sound reached my ears. It was an unusual sound, completely baffling. The source of these mysterious sounds emanated from her living room, distinct from the sounds of the TV. They echoed through the room with a clarity and realism that were almost tangible. They rebounded off the walls, creating a disconcerting atmosphere. Immediately, an anxious feeling gripped me, and my heart raced while a knot formed in my stomach. A wave of uncertainty washed over me, making me ponder whether to proceed or retreat. But curiosity overpowered caution and pushed me to move cautiously toward the source of the noise, trying not to startle her. With each step, the intensity of the sounds increased, sending a sickening feeling through me. When I cautiously peeked around the corner, my world shattered into countless pieces. There, on the very sofa where we had spent countless nights together, I saw a sight that tore my heart apart. Emily, the love of my life, was locked in an embrace with none other than my own brother. I froze in place as if time had stopped, struggling to grasp the betrayal unfolding before my eyes. My mind raced, desperately searching for some explanation for this nightmare. However, no reasoning could account for the depth of pain and betrayal I felt at that moment. It seemed that Emily's betrayal not only shattered our relationship, but also shattered my very core. In a shocking act of betrayal, my own brother John not only betrayed me, but also secretly started a relationship with my girlfriend, Emily. The pain I felt at that moment is beyond words, as if the very foundation of my world crumbled in an instant. Emily, whom I once considered the love and inspiration of my life, has now become the cause of my emotional devastation. As the room spun around me, the initial shock gradually gave way to an overwhelming surge of anger coursing through my veins. Feeling the weight of my emotions, I knew I had to get out of this toxic situation before doing something I'd regret. I quietly left this painful scene, and an unbearable pain pierced my heart. How could both John and Emily betray me like this? While I always had a strained relationship with John, the fact that he had an affair with my girlfriend was a cruel blow. It felt like he was meant to succeed in every aspect of life, while I was always left on the sidelines. And Emily? Despite everything that once connected us, my love for her had now turned into intense, consuming hatred that I couldn't control. When my relationship with John was completely shattered, I was consumed by anger. In the following days, I gave Emily what she seemed to want most: distance. Fueled by rage, I took a few days off under the pretext of being sick and retreated to the basement. In my isolation, impulsive thoughts began to flood my mind, threatening to override my common sense. The desire to call John's wife and reveal the truth burned within me. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't be enough. It wouldn't satisfy the insatiable thirst for retribution that had taken hold of me. Then, a sudden realization hit me like a lightning bolt. It became clear that I needed to ensure they faced the consequences for their actions directly. With this newfound determination, I arranged another family dinner, disguising it as an important announcement about significant changes in my life. The evening seemed normal, with our parents present. But then, my seemingly perfect brother and his unsuspecting bride joined us. His appearance, as if everything were normal, and his attempts to strike up a conversation with me fueled my endless anger. His calm demeanor, as if his affair with my girlfriend meant nothing, infuriated me. I bided my time, waiting for everyone to sit down and enjoy the meal before making my move. However, just as I was about to speak, Emily intervened in the conversation. I couldn't help but notice her subtle hints, the change in her tone, the way she laughed at his jokes, and the wide smiles she directed exclusively at him. It was unbearable. Desperate for attention, I seized the moment, pretending I was finally ready to share my long-awaited news. The audience fell into an expectant silence, eagerly awaiting my words. As all eyes turned to me, I stood up with a glass of wine in my hand. Carefully calculated, I turned to my brother, putting on a facade of admiration, and began showering him with praise, highlighting his achievements and expressing deep pride in his relentless pursuit of his desires. He absorbed every word, relishing the attention. Deep down, it hurt to see his smug grin, as if his superiority remained intact despite my deliberate efforts to elevate him with compliments. Glancing at Emily, I noticed a distinct spark in her eyes when she looked at my brother. It was a mesmerizing look, as if he embodied everything she had ever wanted and more. I clung to the glass, threatening to shatter it under the pressure of anger, but I couldn't let go. A surge of rage surged through my veins, urging me to finish my speech quickly. With a forced smile, I raised my glass, congratulating my brother on his illicit affair with my girlfriend. A tense silence filled the room, and all eyes turned to the guilty couple. I felt an adrenaline rush. My heart pounded, my hands grew sweaty, but I held my composure and took a sip of raspberry wine. Except for Emily and John, everyone in the room wore expressions of surprise and disbelief. They looked like deer caught in headlights. Despite my mother's insistence for me to sit down, I remained firm, determined to share every detail of the events I'd witnessed. I felt that if I had witnessed it, they deserved to hear about it. And so I began my account. I spoke at length about where I found them and the compromising position they were in. Despite my parents' pleas for me to sit down, my gaze never left Emily's teary eyes. I couldn't help but think, how dare she shed tears now after the terrible act she had committed? She had the audacity to sit and pretend to be innocent. John tried to intervene, grabbing my arm and attempting to lead me to a chair, but I quickly pushed him away. I couldn't hold back my words. I needed to express everything that was boiling inside me. As a result, the emotions on the faces of those present ranged from bewilderment to anger. Emily and John exchanged guilty glances, unable to meet anyone's eyes. I remember letting out a bitter, ironic laugh meant solely for their benefit, and then I sank back into my seat, allowing the scene to unfold in front of me like a cinematic spectacle. I had shattered their pristine facade. My parents, who had always viewed my brother as the embodiment of perfection, looked at him with a mix of confusion and disappointment. I relished the moment, reveling in the truth revealed to them. They couldn't summon the courage to deny it. For a brief moment, I forgot about John's fiancée, but she quickly grabbed her glass and hurled it at my brother, causing me to burst into laughter as the wine cascaded down his face. Enraged, she stormed out of the room, tossing her engagement ring at him. My parents, who had always valued honesty and could never have imagined that their beloved son would turn out to be such a despicable person, were left dumbfounded. They chastised him for his complete lack of respect. There was shame and disappointment in their voices, sending a shiver down my spine. Emily, too, couldn't escape their attention. Their gazes turned to her, and they sternly ordered her to leave their house immediately. I didn't look in her direction. I had reached my limit in communicating with her. Even when she tried to apologize to all of us for the horror they had caused, her words entered one ear and quickly exited the other, having no effect. Truth be told, a part of my heart left with her as she walked out the door. When all was said and done, at that moment, I felt like I had hit rock bottom. The consequences were unavoidable. While my parents acknowledged my pain, they disapproved of how I handled the situation. They believed that my brother's fiancée deserved to learn the truth in a more respectful way, and, for the most part, I agreed with them. I must admit, I was somewhat self-centered in that moment, but given the immense pain and profound loss I felt, it was nearly impossible for me to consider anyone else's perspective. As we retired to our bedrooms that evening, a heavy cloud of tension hung over the house. John's worst fears had come to pass. My parents regarded him with a mix of disdain and indifference, and eventually, despite the passage of time, they made the difficult decision to kick him out of our home. It became evident that this situation meant much more to our parents than we initially assumed. I suspect it was fueled by deep affection for his ex-fiancée. He humbled himself to the point of pleading for a change of heart, but they remained resolute in their decision. I couldn't help but sympathize with him, seeing how even his ex-fiancée rejected him and denied him the chance to explain himself. He was left to deal with this on his own. Speaking of his ex-fiancée, she shamelessly exposed him on social media, and many members of our community joined in the public condemnation. John, at one point, became a symbol of shame, the embodiment of dishonor in our town. As for Emily, from what I've heard, her life spiraled into turmoil. She left the fast food restaurant but maintained contact with one of her friends, who happened to be a co-worker of ours. This friend confided in me, revealing that Emily was facing eviction due to substantial rent arrears, and the landlord took her to court. Living in a noisy trailer park, I made a firm decision to seek the same happiness that Emily once brought into my life, but this time I was determined to find it within myself. It may sound sentimental, but I embarked on a profound journey of self-discovery, during which I realized that I deserved more than what others could offer. That's how I reclaimed my destiny. By a stroke of luck, I landed a job that not only paid better but also offered me a chance to break free from my current life situation. When I truly tasted independence for the first time, everything else faded into the background. Here's a lesson I've learned along the way. Never blame yourself for falling in love, and don't ignore warning signs. Most importantly, don't shoulder the blame for someone else's infidelity. If you know you've given your all, it reflects their character, not yours. Take this experience as a lesson and stay vigilant, even when it comes to your own family. You never truly know someone's intentions. As she lay on her modest, inflatable mattress, amid fits of laughter, she confessed her simple desires to me. She didn't aspire to anything extravagant or complicated in life. Her dream was to become a kindergarten teacher, and when she saved enough money, she planned to further her education. It was she who unexpectedly brought up the topic of a date, and I could hardly believe the reality of the moment. Naturally, I accepted her offer, but it was hard for me to fathom that my efforts had been noticed and appreciated. It might sound silly, but in that moment, my 21-year-old self was filled with skepticism. This experience prompted me to adopt a completely new persona, a kind of shield to protect myself from potential rejection or the disappointed looks that sometimes met me. I made a firm decision to stop fixating on John and the image he represented. Choosing to liberate myself from their influence, I boldly decided to distance myself entirely. Getting a job was my first step toward freedom, but it was meeting my new friend that truly illuminated my path and opened up a fresh perspective on life.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another story of Cheating Tales Lab. We're honored to have you here today. Thank you for being part of our community, and we hope this story captivates you. Now, let's dive into this story. The metallic whir of helicopter blades sliced through Seattle's rain-heavy clouds as Antonio Sheridan steadied his patient's foreline. At 45, he'd spent exactly half his life as Seattle's premier trauma flight nurse, and every one of those years showed in the precise economy of his movements. Rain pattered against the helicopter's windows as Jake Morrison, his pilot and friend of 20 years, guided them towards Seattle Grace Hospital. Stats dropping, Antonio called through the headset, his experienced hands already moving to adjust the flow rate. "Jake, we need to pick up the pace." "Already on it," Jake responded, the helicopter banking smoothly as he adjusted their trajectory. 3 minutes out. Antonio nodded, his focus absolute as he monitored the patient's vitals. This was where he belonged, 3,000 feet above Seattle, making split-second decisions that kept people alive. The familiar pressure in his chest tightened slightly, but he ignored it. There would be time for personal concerns later. The landing pad emerged from the mist, its lights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Antonio had already radioed ahead. The trauma team would be waiting. As they touched down, he caught sight of his daughter Emma's white coat among the waiting staff. She'd followed him into medicine, though she'd chosen to keep her feet firmly on the ground. Another miracle in the making, she called out as they rushed the patient inside. No miracles, Antonio replied, his voice steady as he reported the vital signs. Just good medicine. It was their usual exchange, comfortable and familiar. But lately, Emma's smile seemed strained, her eyes carrying a weight he couldn't quite understand. He filed the observation away with all the other small changes he'd noticed recently, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't yet assembled. The annual Seattle Grace Hospital fundraiser transformed the austere medical center's conference center into what Lori Sheridan, his wife of 23 years and head of donor relations, called an appropriate setting for seven-figure donations. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in imported silk, while Seattle's medical elite mingled with the city's wealthiest potential donors. Antonio adjusted his bow tie, a concession to the formal dress code he endured once a year. From his position near the bar, he had a clear view of Lori working the room. She moved with practiced grace in her silver Versace dress, a recent purchase she'd claimed was necessary for the position. Dr. Kent Pratt stood too close to her as they spoke with an elderly couple Antonio recognized as major donors. The new cardiothoracic surgeon had arrived 6 months ago with impressive credentials and an ego to match. Now, watching Kent's hands settle on Lori's lower back with casual familiarity, Antonio felt his investigative instincts spark to life. Your wife certainly knows how to command a room. Sarah Chen's voice carried a note of careful observation as she joined him. Seattle Grace's administrator had been his friend for 15 years, long enough to know when she was probing for information. She's good at her job, Antonio replied neutrally, noting how Lori and Kent moved between groups in perfect synchronization, their professional smiles never wavering. Speaking of jobs, Sarah kept her voice low. Have you reviewed the proposal for the new cardiac wing? The one Kent's pushing for? Numbers seemed rushed. Very rushed. Sarah sipped her champagne. Interesting choice of contractors, too. Same company that built his wing in Portland. Facility had issues from day one, but the paperwork was impeccable. Before Antonio could respond, Emma appeared at his elbow. His daughter's emerald cocktail dress was a stark contrast to her usual resident scrubs, making her look more like her mother than he'd ever noticed before. Dad, Mrs. Henderson wants to hear about the mountain rescue from last month. Emma's smile was bright but didn't reach her eyes. You know, the one with the stranded hiking group? Antonio caught the quick glance she shot toward Lori and Kent. Mrs. Henderson can wait. Sarah and I were discussing. Please, Emma's grip on his arm tightened fractionally. She's considering a major donation to the emergency response unit. Sarah touched his sleeve lightly. We'll continue this later, Antonio. Some things need a closer look. Her meaningful glance toward Kent and Lori made it clear she wasn't talking about hospital finances. As Emma led him away, Antonio watched Kent lean in to whisper something in Lori's ear. His wife's laugh carried across the room, the same practice sound she used when convincing donors to add zeros to their checks. The rest of the evening followed a pattern. Every time Antonio moved toward Lori and Kent, Emma appeared with another donor who urgently needed to hear his stories. By the time the last guest departed, he'd cataloged 27 instances of unnecessary physical contact between his wife and the surgeon, 15 secretive whispers, and 4 moments when they disappeared briefly from the room within minutes of each other. The drive home was silent, Lori claiming a headache and retiring immediately to their bedroom. Antonio stayed in his study, reviewing hospital documents Sarah had quietly passed him earlier. The numbers for the cardiac wing didn't add up, cost projections were inflated, equipment requests excessive, and the timeline suspiciously accelerated. His chest tightened as he worked, the pain sharper than usual. Another item for his growing list of concerns, filed away with his wife's recent changed behaviors and his daughter's strange anxiety. The following weeks brought a parade of closed-door meetings Lori claimed were donor consultations. Antonio used the time to investigate, his years of emergency response work making him methodical in gathering information. The contractor's bid is 40% higher than market rate, Jake confirmed over coffee in the pilot's lounge between flights. Same pattern as Portland, according to my contacts there. Antonio rubbed his chest absently. Sarah mentioned unusual consultation patterns in the cardiac unit. Private meetings not logged in the official schedule. Speaking of unusual, Jake leaned forward, voice low. You seen the maintenance contracts for the new equipment Kent's requesting? Companies I've never heard of. Terms that make no sense for a hospital our size. Their discussion ended with the emergency alert. Minutes later, they were airborne, heading toward a multi-car pileup on Interstate 5. Antonio pushed personal concerns aside, focusing on the information coming through his headset. The chest pain struck during patient assessment. One moment he was checking pupillary response. The next device clamped around his heart. The pen light clattered to the helicopter floor as pain shot down his left arm. Antonio? Jake's voice seemed distant through the roaring in his ears. Left, chest. Antonio managed, training taking over even as his vision grayed. Radiating arm. Jake's response was immediate. Seattle Grace, Life Flight 7 declaring medical emergency. Flight nurse having severe chest pain, possible MI. Diverting for immediate landing. Antonio fumbled with his Garmin medical watch. Standard equipment Jake had insisted on after too many disputed in-flight decisions. Through the growing haze, he activated the recording feature, years of handling complicated cases having taught him to document everything. The last thing he saw before consciousness faded was Lori's face as they wheeled him into the ER. Her expression wasn't panic or concern. It was calculated satisfaction as she typed rapidly on her phone. Kent will take excellent care of everything, she said, voice carrying a note of anticipation that sent chills through Antonio's fading awareness. He's the best after all. As darkness claimed him, he heard Kent Pratt's authoritative voice. I'm taking this case. Cancel the on-call surgeon. Recovery brought a steady stream of suspicious activities. Insurance agents Antonio had never met appeared within hours, claiming Lori had contacted them months ago to review their policies. They spoke quietly with Kent between rounds. Their discussions focused on policy details, particularly the triple payout clause for in-hospital deaths. Quite forward-thinking of your wife, one agent remarked while checking Antonio's paperwork. Upgrading the policy when she did. These things are always easier to arrange before any incidents. Kent's residents monitored him constantly, except for Emma, who could barely enter the room. When she did, her hands shook as she checked his vitals, her eyes avoiding his face. Sarah visited late one night, after the residents' rounds. She closed the door carefully before approaching his bed. I've been looking into Kent's previous positions, she said quietly, showing him a folder. 5 hospitals in 10 years. Each had a string of deaths, terminal patients, all with massive insurance payouts. And every time, there was a grieving spouse who suddenly acquired beach property within months. Antonio studied the medication charts Sarah provided, his years of medical experience noting the discrepancies. The doses were subtly wrong, not enough to trigger immediate concerns, but sufficient to slowly stress a recovering heart. Your wife's name is on the title search for a beachfront property in Malibu, Sarah added. Dated 3 months ago, held in a blind trust until closing. The same realtor handled 3 similar properties for widows from Kent's previous hospitals. Before Antonio could respond, footsteps approached. Sarah slipped the folder away as Emma entered. Her white coat wrinkled from a long shift. Dad, she started, then stopped at the sight of Sarah. I should come back later. Stay, Antonio said firmly, but she was already backing toward the door, the same haunted look in her eyes he'd seen at the fundraiser. After she left, Sarah squeezed his hand. Rest. I'm having some people look into things. Just be careful what medications you accept. Antonio closed his eyes, appearing to drift off, but his hand moved slightly, ensuring his medical watch was still recording. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he assembled the pieces of the puzzle. His wife's suspicious behavior, Kent's rushed proposals, Emma's strange actions, and the growing evidence of a deadly pattern repeated across multiple hospitals. The pain in his chest was still there, but now it had a different quality. This wasn't just medical, this was betrayal, carefully planned and professionally executed. But Antonio Sheridan hadn't spent 20 years saving lives by giving up when things got difficult. He kept his breathing steady, listening as Kent's resident adjusted his medication drip. They thought they were dealing with a vulnerable patient, weakened by surgery and grief. They had no idea they'd given him exactly what he needed. A front-row seat to their operation, with every word and action recorded by the device on his wrist. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. The midnight silence in Antonio's hospital room was broken only by the steady beep of monitors. His eyes remained closed, breathing measured, as familiar voices drifted through his partially open door. The Garmin watch on his wrist blinked silently, recording every word. "The Cayman account is ready." Kent's voice carried a hint of impatience. "Another week of this waiting game, and we risk someone connecting the patterns." "Don't lecture me about patterns," Lori snapped. The clicking of her heels against tile indicated her pacing. "I've managed 3 hospitals' worth of paperwork without leaving traces. The Malibu property is nearly ready. We stick to the timeline. Your daughter's becoming erratic. Did you see how she fumbled the medication orders yesterday? Emma knows what's at stake. One call to the medical board about her little pharmaceutical adventure during residency, and she'll be lucky to work as a veterinary assistant." Their voices faded down the hallway. Antonio waited 5 minutes, then pressed the call button. Emma appeared moments later, her white coat wrinkled from a long shift, dark circles prominent under her eyes. "Your stats look stable," she said mechanically, avoiding his gaze as she checked the monitors. "Sit down." Antonio's voice was quiet, but carried the same authority he used during critical rescues. When she hesitated, he added, "Remember that hiker we airlifted when you were 10? You held his hand the whole flight, promised him he'd be okay. That's who you are, Emma. Not this." The words hit their mark. Emma collapsed into the chair, tears breaking through her professional facade. "I never wanted." During intern year, the hours were endless. Someone offered me Adderall to stay awake, then benzos to sleep. It spiraled so fast. Kent and your mother found out. She nodded miserably. "They said they'd help keep it quiet, protect my career. But it was just leverage. First they wanted information about your schedule, access to your records, then medication adjustments, signing off on altered charts. Details." Antonio's voice hardened. "Everything they've made you do. Start from the beginning." Emma's confession poured out. How Kent had backdated consultation notes, creating false histories of cardiac symptoms. How Lori used her donor relations position to identify wealthy patients with large insurance policies. The systematic way they stressed recovering hearts with subtle medication changes until natural cardiac events occurred. "There are others," Emma whispered. "Other residents they control. The private facility they're trying to transfer you to, it's owned by Kent's medical school friend. Patients who go there don't come back." Antonio's expression remained neutral, but his mind cataloged every detail. "The medication changes. Show me." Emma pulled out his chart with trembling hands. "They're subtle. Microdoses of medications that stress the heart. Nothing obvious enough to trigger pharmacy alerts, but compounding effects over time." She pointed to specific orders. "These are all falsified. I signed some of them. You'll sign no more." His tone allowed no argument. "Now listen carefully. Tomorrow morning, you'll do your rounds as usual. Act normal. When Kent or your mother give orders, agree, but do nothing. Understood?" She nodded, wiping her eyes. "Dad, I'm so—" "Save it." He cut her off. "Redemption comes through actions, not words. Go." After she left, Antonio activated his phone. The call was answered on the first ring. "Jake. Time to call in that favor from Reuben Benton." The next morning brought a flurry of activity. Jake arrived early, carrying coffee and a thick folder of flight logs. "Reuben's on board," he reported quietly. "Been wanting to nail Kent since his Portland days. I've got documentation of every suspicious patient transfer over the last 6 months. All terminal patients, all wealthy, all dead within days of reaching his friend's private facility." "Good." Antonio reviewed the logs. Sarah's blocking their attempt to transfer me there. They'll try something else. As if on cue, Lori swept in, designer heels clicking against tile. Her smile was practiced, predatory. Darling, we've been discussing your care options. Kent knows an excellent private facility. Request denied. Sarachin entered behind her, hospital administrator's badge prominent. Hospital policy requires peer review for high-risk transfers. Dr. Peterson will be taking over Antonio's care. Kent appeared in the doorway, his usual smooth confidence cracking slightly. As department head, Sarah's voice could have cut steel. You're needed in the board meeting. Now. After they left, Sarah turned to Antonio. Ruben's people are in place. We've got FBI agents posing as orderlies on every shift. Security cameras have been adjusted to cover medication storage areas. They'll retaliate, Jake warned. Antonio's smile was cold. I'm counting on it. The counterattack came within hours. Anonymous complaints about Antonio's flight record appeared on Sarah's desk, alleging missed protocols and questionable decisions during critical transports. Amateur work, Jake scoffed, reviewing them. I've got witness statements and documentation for every flight, every decision, every outcome. More concerning was the leak about Emma's drug history to the medical board. But Sarah Chun was prepared. Complete rehabilitation records, she informed the hastily convened review committee, laying out documented evidence. Regular drug tests, counseling sessions, performance reviews. All clean. I can also provide documentation showing who accessed these confidential records without authorization. The committee members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Someone was facing serious HIPAA violations. Meanwhile, Antonio's watch kept recording. Late-night conversations between Kent and Lori grew increasingly desperate. The insurance company's auditing previous cases, Kent hissed during one midnight visit. We need to finish this now. Then stop talking and do it. Lori's voice was ice. The transfer failed, but we still have medication access. Make it look natural, like the others. The final night arrived exactly as Antonio had predicted. His room was dark when Lori and Ken entered, carrying a new medication bag. Such a shame about these cardiac complications, Lori sighed, her voice dripping false concern. At least the triple payout will secure Emma's future. Speaking of payouts, Antonio's voice caused them both to freeze as he sat up, removing his oxygen mask. You should have checked my watch more carefully, honey. It records everything within 20 feet, including your murder plot. The lights flashed on. FBI agents emerged from the bathroom and supply closet, weapons drawn. Reuben Benton stepped forward, badge gleaming. Dr. Kent Pratt, Mrs. Lori Sheridan, he announced with satisfaction, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and a growing list of federal charges. You can't prove anything, Kent snarled, but his face had gone pale. Actually, Sarachin entered, holding up a tablet. We can prove everything. Your previous victims' families have been very cooperative, once shown evidence of insurance fraud and premeditated murder. As they were led away in handcuffs, Lori attempted one final strike. Emma was involved too. She falsified charts, changed medication order. Under documented coercion, Antonio cut her off coldly. Unlike you, she chose to help stop this before more people died. The arrest continued through the night. Insurance agents who had backdated policies. Kent's friend at the private facility who helped cover up suspicious deaths. The real estate agent holding the Malibu property in trust. Offshore accounts located, Reuben reported as the sun rose. Looks like they've been running this scheme longer than we thought. Multiple hospitals, dozens of victims. Good. Antonio's voice was steel. More evidence for prosecution. The morning brought a parade of federal agents collecting evidence and taking statements. Through it all, Antonio's watch kept recording, not because it was needed anymore, but because thorough documentation had become habit. Sarachin surveyed the activity with grim satisfaction. The board will be meeting to discuss emergency replacements in cardiology and donor relations. Check their references thoroughly this time, Antonio suggested, his voice carrying no trace of humor. Emma appeared in the doorway, looking lost. Dad, your statement to the FBI. Everything they made you do, everything you saw. Leave nothing out. His tone was professional, detached. "The evidence you've provided helps ensure they can't hurt anyone else." She nodded, understanding the unspoken message. There would be time for personal reconciliation later. For now, there was work to be done. Through the window, dawn painted Seattle's skyline in shades of possibility. The conspirators who had thought Antonio vulnerable had learned too late what his patients had always known. Sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one who waits, watches, and strikes with calculated precision when the moment is right. The federal courthouse buzzed with tension as Antonio Sheridan took the witness stand. 6 months had passed since the arrests, and the trial had exposed a web of corruption deeper than anyone imagined. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Diana Hayes, approached with purpose. "Mr. Sheridan, please tell the court about the evidence you gathered." Antonio's voice carried the same steady authority he used in medical emergencies. The watch recordings documented multiple conversations between Dr. Pratt and Lori Sheridan planning my murder. They discussed offshore accounts, property purchases, and how to make my death appear natural. From the defense table, Kent's expensive suit couldn't hide his seething anger. Lori sat beside him, her designer prison jumpsuit a far cry from her usual attire, her face a mask of cold disdain. "In the previous cases?" Hayes prompted. Investigation revealed similar patterns at 3 other hospitals. Kent would identify wealthy patients through Lori's donor relations network. They'd falsify symptoms, manipulate medications, then profit from insurance payouts when patients died in their private facility. The evidence mounted through the day. Financial records showed millions flowing through shell companies. Former hospital staff testified about suspicious transfers and sudden deaths. Family members of previous victims described identical patterns, loved ones with manageable conditions suddenly deteriorating after meeting Kent and being transferred to his friend's facility. They used their positions to identify targets. Jake Morrison testified, his pilot's precision evident in his detailed documentation. Every wealthy patient with good insurance became a potential victim. The flight records showed a clear pattern of emergency transfers to their private facility, always followed by death certificates citing natural causes. Sarah Chin's testimony proved devastating. Dr. Pratt used his department authority to override normal protocols. Mrs. Sheridan's donor relations position gave them access to patients' financial information. Together, they created a perfect killing system for profit. The most damaging testimony came from Dr. Michael Warren, a resident who had worked with Kent at his previous hospital. "He blackmailed me too, just like Emma Sheridan. When I threatened to expose him, another resident who knew about the scheme committed suicide. They used that death to control the rest of us, claiming we'd be implicated if we spoke up." Through it all, Antonio sat ramrod straight in the gallery, watching his former wife's facade crack as each new piece of evidence emerged. When she finally took the stand in her own defense, her attempt at playing the victim fell apart under cross-examination. "You expect us to believe you were unaware of these deaths?" Hayes demanded. "I was just doing my job." Lori's voice dripped contempt. "Finding donors, building relationships. If some of them happened to die under Kent's care, that's hardly my. Yet you purchased property in Malibu 3 months before attempting to murder your husband," Hayes cut in. "Property paid for with money traced directly to previous victims' insurance payouts." Antonio was a fool, Lori snapped, her mask finally slipping. So concerned with saving lives, he never saw the opportunity. "Do you know what it's like being married to someone so blindly righteous?" Kent understood ambition. He knew how to turn all those dying patients into something useful. The jury took less than 6 hours to reach a verdict. Kent stood arrogantly as the forewoman read the charges, his confidence crumbling with each guilty. 30 years for conspiracy to commit murder. 30 more for the deaths at previous hospitals. Additional decades for fraud, racketeering, and money laundering. Lori's sentencing came next. She remained coldly composed until the judge spoke. "Your actions betray not just your marriage vows, but the fundamental trust between medical institutions and the public," he declared. "You used your position to identify victims, exploited families at their most vulnerable, and attempted to murder your own husband for profit. 30 years seems insufficient, but it's the maximum I can impose." As they were led away, Lori turned to Antonio. I hope you're satisfied with your moral victory. Was it worth destroying everything we built? Antonio's response was calm, measured, and final. We built nothing. I saved lives while you plotted deaths. The only difference is now everyone knows exactly what you are. The aftermath brought changes. Emma testified about her coerced involvement in exchange for immunity. Her voice shook as she detailed how they'd exploited her addiction and threatened her career. I started using Adderall during intern year, she admitted to the court. Kent found out, offered to help keep it quiet. Then they started small, asking me to adjust medication orders, sign off on chart changes. When I realized what was happening to the patients, they threatened to expose my drug history, said I was already implicated, would lose my medical license. The judge recommended minimum immunity requirements in exchange for her cooperation. Within a week, Emma transferred to Chicago's trauma unit. Her goodbye with Antonio was brief, professional. She left a letter he filed away unopened in his desk, marked simply past complications. Later, cameras caught Kent's private facility being raided, his medical school friend led away in handcuffs. The forensic audit revealed dozens of suspicious deaths, each following the same pattern. Wealthy patients transferred in, massive insurance payouts transferred out. They found offshore accounts totaling millions, Sarah Chin reported, reviewing the final case files in Antonio's office. Every victim's insurance payout, every property deal, all perfectly documented by their own greed. And the Malibu property? Antonio asked, though he already knew. Seized along with everything else. The federal prosecutor is arranging for proceeds to go to the victims' families. Antonio nodded, satisfied. Justice had its own kind of precision, not unlike the medical calculations he made every day in the air. The correct diagnosis, the proper treatment, the right outcome. It all came down to paying attention to details. Weeks passed. The media circus faded. Antonio returned to his trauma flights, the familiar thrum of helicopter blades drowning out courtroom echoes. Each mission reminded him why he'd chosen this path. Not for profit or power, but for the fundamental duty to preserve life. The letters from Emma arrived monthly, postmarked from Chicago. Each one went unopened into the desk box labeled past complications. Some wounds needed time before examination, and Antonio had learned that timing was everything, in medicine, in justice, and in healing. Sarah Chin transitioned out of hospital administration but continued working with oversight committees, using lessons from the case to protect other institutions. Together, they turned their experience into reform, establishing protocols to catch similar schemes before they claimed more victims. Jake remained his steady partner in the air, their wordless understanding strengthened by shared battle scars. They never discussed the trial, but their flight logs became even more detailed, every decision documented with meticulous care. Antonio's legitimate insurance payout could have bought beachfront property in any exclusive neighborhood. Instead, he chose a modest house on Oregon's quiet coast, far from Malibu's pretension. The view wasn't as spectacular, but it was honest, like the work that paid for it. In the end, the biggest change wasn't in policies or procedures. It was in perspective. Every Thursday evening, after his last flight shift, Antonio would take a moment to watch the sunset from 2,000 feet. From that height, the line between light and shadow was crystal clear. He'd learned that some people chose the shadows, turning medicine's healing purpose into a weapon for profit. His job wasn't to understand them or to regret their choices. His job was to recognize the darkness when it appeared, stand against it without flinching, and always fly toward the light of dawn. The helicopter's radio crackled. Another emergency, another life hanging in balance. Antonio pushed memories aside, focusing on the coordinates with professional precision. The past had its place, filed away in courthouse records and desk drawers. The future waited in the next rescue, the next flight, the next chance to prove that even in medicine's darkest corners, there were still those who remembered their fundamental oath. First, do no harm. And for Antonio Sheridan, that was enough. Epilogue. 5 years later. The federal maximum security prison's visitor room remained as austere as the day Lori Sheridan first entered it. 5 years into her 30-year sentence, the former donor relations director's designer confidence had eroded into institutional monotony. Her orange jumpsuit hung loose on her frame, expensive highlights grown out to reveal steel gray roots. The guard's voice echoed. Visitor for Sheridan. Sarah Chun sat across the table, official paperwork in hand. Your appeal was denied. Again. Get out. Lori's voice had lost its smooth, manipulative edge, replaced by bitter harshness. You'll want to hear this, Sarah continued, unmoved. The feds found another offshore account. The victims' families are getting those funds too. That beach house you dreamed of? They're turning it into a recovery center for medical professionals dealing with ethical pressures. Lori's hands clenched. Still playing the righteous administrator? How's my ex-husband's little reform crusade going? Antonio's foundation has exposed 4 more schemes like yours. Interesting pattern, doctors and administrators working together, targeting wealthy patients. Sound familiar? Sarah's smile was professional, pointed. Your case study is now required reading in medical ethics courses. 3 cells down, Kent Pratt's fall from grace had been even more dramatic. The former surgeon spent 23 hours a day in isolation. Other inmates had their own code about doctors who killed for profit. His medical license was permanently revoked, his academic papers retracted, his name becoming synonymous with healthcare fraud. His latest appeal had included a rambling manifesto claiming conspiracy. The judge's response was brief. Petition denied. Kent's former medical school friend, serving 20 years for his role in the private facility deaths, had turned state's evidence, providing details of even more victims. Meanwhile, Seattle Grace Hospital had transformed. Antonio's trauma flight program now included intensive ethics training. Every new flight nurse learned not just medical procedures, but warning signs of institutional corruption. Your primary duty is to your patients, he told each class, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Politics, profit, pressure. None of that matters at 2,000 feet with a life in your hands. Jake Morrison, still his pilot after 25 years, would add his own lessons. Document everything. Trust your instincts. And if something feels wrong, it probably is. Their partnership had become legendary in emergency response circles. Each flight logged with military precision, every decision documented, creating an unbreakable chain of accountability. Sarah Chin's retirement from hospital administration hadn't slowed her down. The foundation she and Antonio started had grown into a national watchdog organization. They provided anonymous reporting systems, legal support, and protection for medical professionals facing ethical dilemmas. We lost 2 residents to suicide because they felt trapped, she reminded oversight committees. That never happens again. Emma found her own path to redemption in Chicago. Rising to chief resident, she channeled her experience into protecting new doctors from similar exploitation. Her trauma unit became known for both medical excellence and ethical integrity. Her monthly letters to Antonio continued, still filed unopened in his desk, but recently, he'd moved them to a new box labeled Future Considerations. Some wounds healed enough to examine, given time. The Oregon Coast House proved perfect for Antonio's needs. Close enough to his flight duties, far enough from painful memories. On clear evenings, he'd watch the sunset from his deck, the same time he used to view it from the helicopter. The final ironies proved fitting. Lori's carefully hidden funds now supported whistleblower programs. Kent's private facility became a treatment center for impaired medical professionals. Their elaborate scheme to profit from death instead strengthened protections for life. Prison reports showed their true characters. Lori attempted to manipulate other inmates, only to find her tactics useless in a world where designer smiles meant nothing. Kent's arrogance crumbled into paranoid isolation, his surgeon's hands now used only to write failed appeals. They aged separately, similarly. Each court rejection, each seized asset, each new revelation of their crimes stripped away more of their carefully constructed facades. The beautiful socialite and ambitious surgeon reduced to cautionary tales in medical ethics lectures. Their victims' families found different forms of closure. Some used the recovered funds for medical scholarships. Others established patient advocacy programs. All ensured their loved ones' deaths served to protect future patients. Antonio's foundation grew beyond its origins. They trained hospital staff to recognize warning signs, provided legal resources for ethical challenges, and maintained a database of suspicious patterns in patient care. The system only works if we protect those who protect patients, he would tell medical boards. His testimony helped pass legislation strengthening whistleblower protections in healthcare. Jake still flew their regular routes, their weekly sunset flights now a tradition. They'd added a third seat for training new flight nurses, passing on lessons learned at terrible cost. Sarah Chin's oversight committees expanded nationally. Corruption thrives in shadows, she testified before medical boards. Our job is to keep the lights on. Emma's trauma unit in Chicago became a model program, combining intensive medical training with ethical leadership. Her residents learned early that moral courage was as vital as medical skill. The desk box of her letters remained ready. When the time came to open them, Antonio knew the conversations would be about future healing, not past wounds. The final word came through official channels. Lori and Kent's last appeal had been rejected. The court's language was unmistakable. They would serve every day of their 30 years. In his Oregon home, Antonio filed the notice without comment. Tomorrow would bring new flights, new patients, new chances to prove that medicine's highest purpose remained unchanged. To heal, to protect, to serve life rather than profit from death. The helicopter waited on its pad, blades ready to turn, Jake checking the pre-flight list with characteristic precision. Another trauma call, another life hanging in balance. Some chose darkness, others chose light. Antonio Sheridan had always known which way to fly.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy the story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.